Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Thursday everybody. Let's begin today's video with the outbreak and zero COVID situation, and things are looking grim. State media reports that starting today, residents of the capital, Beijing, are required to reduce their movements around the city, with a negative COVID test result required every 48 hours in order to visit public venues. New official daily cases in the sensitive capital have now passed 1,000. Meanwhile, today, Thursday, nationwide, new official infections surged past 30,000. Major cities of concern remain Beijing and Tianjin in the north, Chongqing and Chengdu in the southwest, and Guangzhou in the south. Yesterday, Guangzhou announced that it has 70,000 beds in temporary hospitals available for asymptomatic and lightly symptomatic patients. Dozens of smaller cities are facing lockdowns too. Indeed, a Nomura note this week estimates that approximately 25% of the nation's economy is now under some form of lockdown or restriction. However, analysts admit that the shift to lockdowns that are enforced for buildings or neighborhoods rather than through citywide restrictions, as was the case in Shanghai earlier this year, has made it more difficult to track the effects on China's economy. One ANZ Bank economist, speaking to the US-based Wall Street Journal, expressed that attempting to assess the economic fallout at this point is, quote, mostly guesswork, end quote. As we discussed yesterday, today Shanghai implemented strict new movement restrictions intended to disincentivize people traveling to and from the megacity. Analysts are now warning what we on China Update have been saying for some time now, that the opening up of the country may be much slower than the market previously hoped. For example, Bloomberg Intelligence wrote yesterday, quote, the euphoric reaction to China's softening of its zero-COVID stance looks misplaced. Giving full reopening may lead to 5.8 million ICU admissions. To avoid this, continued caution across many regions in China will be needed, but this will prolong the time to full reopening beyond 2023. End quote. Reports continue to trickle out about deepening frustration within local officialdom. Quote, we wanted to do what the people were calling for. We wanted to open up. But then we did and everyone was scared. The changes have been fast. We've totally confused the residents. The government faces a dilemma. China's economy has turned into what it is now. It's not good. But if we fully open up, hospitals will be overrun, not only with COVID cases, but also with other underlying diseases it brings out. It will take a lot of medical resources. We'll be overwhelmed. End quote. Zhengzhou, provincial capital of Henan province, population 10 million, has announced 5 days of so-called fluid management starting tomorrow, which sounds like a form of lockdown. Zhengzhou, we remember, is the site of the large Foxconn factory, which has been experiencing issues in recent months. And it is now also the site of yet another set of violent protests. We remember recently too, protests erupted in Guangzhou in response to tightening COVID restrictions there. Workers at the factory in Zhengzhou shared more than a dozen videos that show staff in a standoff with lines of police officers with batons and clad in white protective gear. The videos show police beating workers, with some bleeding from their heads and others limping away from clashes. Onlookers yell, fight, fight, as throngs of people force their way past barricades. At one point, several surround an occupied police car and begin rocking the vehicle while screaming. The Taiwanese company, Foxconn, responsible for assembling Apple iPhones, said in a statement on Wednesday that some new hires at the Zhengzhou campus had complained to the company about work allowances, adding, quote, with respect to the violence, the company will continue to communicate with employees and the government to prevent similar incidents from happening again. End quote. Early reports claim that some workers are angry that the terms of the so-called retention allowance, which had been promised to new employees who stay at the factory, have been changed. Other reports say that protests started overnight over unpaid wages and fears of spreading infections. Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post reports today that the Foxconn factory has now promised to pay each newly hired worker 10,000 RMB, $1,400 to leave the campus immediately, quote, in a desperate move to end protests that have turned violent, end quote. Of course, this is a huge mess for Foxconn, and Apple and international businesses should be watching these developments closely. Quote, with demand remaining firm into holiday season, we would estimate this negatively impacting roughly 5% of iPhone sales this quarter based on impacted China production supply issues. While not the news any bull wants to hear from Apple, it's a supply issue and related to China's zero-COVID policy, which is a very frustrating situation for Apple and its investors, yet again, but not demand-driven, end quote. And, quote, the Foxconn situation raises concern for China's leaders because it challenges the narrative of being a reliable supplier. It's clear workers are not happy being locked down, end quote. And finally, quote, this mess is another reminder of how Apple's over-reliance on China for its supply chains is a massive material risk factor for the company and investors can no longer ignore. I believe Apple leadership understands this, belatedly, but the Shanghai lockdown and now the instability over the last several weeks at Zhengzhou Foxconn have made it impossible to ignore, end quote. Next up, the housing crisis. Hey guys, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button, and as always, anyone who's willing and able to go that extra mile, help me keep this channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. As always, thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. Okay, we just had a lot on zero COVID. The other major challenge for Chinese policymakers is of course the ongoing housing crisis. The so-called Notice of the People's Bank of China and the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission on improving the current financial support for the steady and healthy development of the real estate market was made public yesterday. We discussed the measures last week. Most analysts, including yours truly, do not expect these new measures to do much more than stem the bleeding in the wider real estate industry, but these measures do suggest that Beijing has realized just how dangerous the real estate situation has become, or perhaps has blinked and decided to back off. On the notice and the 16 measures, Chinese financial media outlet Cailian news agency writes today that the policy, quote, will have a positive and important impact on the current real estate market to create such new supporting tools as matching financing and extend the transition period in the management policy of mortgage concentration, end quote. The 16 measures, quote, fully support the stable and healthy development of the real estate market from both ends of supply and demand, end quote. And, quote, the core logic of the policy is the extension of corporate bond plus support for financing to stabilize market players, guaranteeing delivery of projects promotes the confident recovery of buyers, and supports personal purchase credit to drive the recovery of market sales, end quote. This position from the outlet seems to be towing the party line, but perhaps is a little overly optimistic about the effects of these measures. Of course, only time will tell. In addition to these measures, China's state-owned banks announced yesterday that they have launched a concerted effort to strengthen the finances of struggling property developers, with more than 220 billion RMB, $30.7 billion in new credit lines. But like I said, the consensus currently seems to be that these measures do not do much more than stem the bleeding, especially with the damage and uncertainty of zero COVID. Quote, because of the zero-COVID policy, all the ongoing property easing might not be transmitted into the property sector recovery, end quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you all tomorrow.